Ladies and gentlemen, thank you so much for joining us today. Our panel will focus on the green part of the Green New Deal, insofar as we will keep the comments to focus on the environment. And so I'm joined by an extremely distinguished panel. Their biographies are extensive, as is their experience, so you have all of the bios in your packet. But just by way of brief introduction, to my left, we have Jonathan Elkind, who is a senior fellow here at the Center for Global Energy Policy. And then we have Dan Carroll, who is the head of financial markets program at the Milken Institute, and Robert Bryce, who is an esteemed author on many books on energy and power, as well as a filmmaker. So really thinking about the relationship between climate change, economics, and crisis. The first question we have when we think about the environmental part of the Green New Deal is how much of a crisis is this? How big of a crisis is it relative to other crises? How much of climate change, if we do indeed believe that it is happening, is due to human-related activities? And so with that, I'll turn to Jonathan first to opine on the views on climate change.
Sure, and just a couple of words to start and kind of level set for the conversation by talking about elements in regard to energy and climate of the Green New Deal as it has currently been framed. Before I do that, I think it's useful to provide for the audience's consideration a framework for what it is that we need in order to have success in responding to the climate challenge. And I would suggest that there are three elements that constitute successful responses on climate. The first is speed, the second is scale, the third is durability. It's not enough to wait for the perfect solution to materialize in the fullness of time. We're fighting the clock. We need action now. We need speed. Secondly, it's not enough to address emissions from one part of our economy, like power generation, for example, which is widely said to be the low-hanging fruit or comparatively low, or one set of countries. For example, North America, Europe, OECD countries. We need solutions that draw in all countries and that progressively address all emissions. Third, it's insufficient also to reach for urgent policy prescriptions that cannot be sustained and indeed cannot be ratcheted up over time. We cannot afford glorious pure thinking that will get rolled back when a different set of political leaders come into office and when people feel, as some will, pinched in the wallet. So I'll leave for later one of the big challenges of this, which is that those three attributes I've just talked about exist in some tension with one another. So what is the Green New Deal, having said that, having proposed that framework? First, it's a framework as of today. It is a bunch of big, some would say crazy big ideas that have been embodied into the congressional resolution that was passed in February. It's meant to, passed by the House, that is. It's meant to be elaborated into a series of proposals for legislative action that would be turned over to the next president. It is a call to arms. It's a manifesto. As Rihanna Gunright, one of the people who is most centrally involved in developing these ideas, has said, it's all about movement building. Green New Deal calls for a 10-year World War II-style mobilization. It states that it is, and I say it, meaning the resolution, states that it is the duty of the U.S. government to achieve a net zero emissions economy with a just transition that creates millions of jobs by investing in infrastructure and industry without harming frontline and vulnerable communities. Laudable, hugely ambitious, I think many would agree. It focuses on broad projects and goals, including greater resiliency in the face of the impacts of a changing climate, infrastructure investments, 100% clean power from what are termed clean, renewable, and zero-emission technologies. We can get into that later. Smart grids, efficient buildings, clean manufacturing, et cetera. It is, again, very, very expansive. And to achieve these projects and goals, the tools that the resolution calls to be used are, among others, capital mobilization, careful exacting environmental impact assessments, universal training and education, research and development, directed investments, particularly to help frontline and vulnerable communities, the creation of union jobs, an employment guarantee, strengthened labor and environmental protections in regard to trade. So again, one gets a sense of the scale, one gets a sense of the ambition that is being discussed here. So let me conclude by reminding about the framework that I think is essential for actually getting to climate solutions that can last and that can deliver impact in the time frame that we need. Speed, scale, durability. I'm sure we'll get into, as the panel continues, we'll get into an evaluation of whether these things are, whether they're the right metrics to use, and if so, how does the Green New Deal measure up? Thank you.
Thank you so much, Jonathan. Dan, we'll turn to you. You've obviously done a lot of work with Governor Newsom, with Governor Brown in California, as well as working in the industry. So there must be some sort of belief that something can be done to reverse this crisis. Is that so?
Yeah, so let me follow up and try to answer Jonathan's question on Green New Deal and then offer up maybe a next level framework for how to evaluate discussions on the panel and in the weeks and months to come. So I'll take a little bit of prerogative as the person. I started something called the Apollo Alliance after 9/11 that was sort of another moon mission effort to try to boost up investment in clean energy. At the time, we did an economic study and we were calling for, a mere $300 billion investment at the time, which, everyone thought we were crazy, but everyone's talking about trillions now, so it seems very modest at the time. I've actually owned the domain names greennewdeal.com and .org since 2005, written about it, so I can really tell you what's in the Green New Deal. I will answer the question personally, which is, to me, I see it as a potentially effective framework to mobilize and build the community infrastructure that we need. In the 30s, it was REA, rural electrification, TVA, and things like that. I think today, rural broadband, urban broadband, new forms of sustainable infrastructure, and I think that's the heart of it. We can quibble about the broader resolution, and I think we will in that conversation today, but I think, Green New Deal has become almost a Rorschach inkblot. People see what they want to see, and so as somebody who teaches infrastructure finance at Georgetown, I just wanted to offer my 4 M's framework so that we can at least unpack the arguments when they're happening in real time. So M number 1 is message. Is Green New Deal an inspiring, patriotic thing? Yes. Is nostalgia risky? I would say yes as well. I would recommend to you the conservative author Yuval Levin wrote a great book called The Fractured Republic several years ago, where it looks at the dangers of both left and right wing interpretation of what trying to get back to the 50s and 60s and what that has led in terms of our politics. In terms of the mechanics of how do we actually get this stuff done, which Jonathan highlighted, there's often a debate between deployment of the technologies we have, energy efficiency and other things. I'm on team deployment. Then there's the idea of breakthrough technology, with Bill Gates and others have talked about, which I think is important. It's not an either-or choice, but there's so much that we can do to deploy what we have. So I tend to be focused on, let's not try to have a home run and get a price on carbon and other things given the politics we have no matter who our next president is, but what can we do at the community bottom-up level to deliver change? And frankly, a lot of the action is at local and state and in PUCs, et cetera. Third M, money. There's going to be a lot of money numbers thrown around. On the one hand, there's lots of capital that can come into projects, and so if you have a good project, it's available. On the other hand, we subsidize, and maybe we can debate a little bit, we've subsidized just about every new energy technology over the years. There's a jump start of tax relief or tax incentives or direct investment or R&D to get it going. The question is, when do we pull back and move to a subsidy-free environment? And then the fourth M that we talk about in our classes is metrics and doing all the math. And so as we get into some of these things, we see the $93 trillion number that Douglas Holtz-Eakin and Jared Bernstein and others will probably discuss a little bit later. It's like 10 to 12 trillion is energy. So we need to be careful about how we talk about these things, and let's try to unpack those when we talk. Let me stop there.
Sure.
Thank you so much. Robert?
I'll follow up on Jonathan's points and also on the scale issue. So cost, scale, and land use. First, cost, and there's a panel later on government debt, but let's keep in mind today, U.S. federal debt is at $22 trillion. We have a nominally Republican president, and we're running $1 trillion a year annual federal deficits. Why does that matter? Because Wood Mackenzie, well-known energy consulting firm, a couple of months ago estimated that getting the electric grid in the U.S. to 100% renewables would cost roughly $4.7 trillion. That amounts to between $20,000 and $35,000 per household in terms of added costs for electricity. In my view, that amounts to a regressive tax on the poor and the middle class, and that, in my view, is problematic. Further, in terms of cost, where we've seen large renewable mandates, South Australia, Germany, Ontario, California, we've seen remarkable increases in electricity prices. So one of the fundamental problems, and what's the caption today, visionary or misguided, I think when it comes to the energy part of this, a lot of this talk about 100% renewables is in fact deeply misguided. We talk about scale. Again, referring to Wood Mackenzie study, they estimated to go to 100% renewables would require 1.6 terawatts, that's 1,000 gigawatts, 1 million megawatts of installed electric generation capacity. Today, in the United States, we have 1 terawatt. So it would require effectively throwing out a full terawatt of existing generation capacity, replacing that, and then adding another 60% on top of that. This is a massive, massive undertaking, especially when we're talking about trying to do it on a decadal time frame when the energy and power systems that we have in place have been built over decades and even more than a century. Scale, Václav Smil, as well as David Keith and Lee Miller from Harvard have estimated the land use impacts, my third point, of going to 100% renewables and trying to achieve it with wind energy. Their estimates to achieve just existing electricity demand in the United States, roughly 3,900 terawatt hours per year, with wind energy would require a land area twice the size of the state of California. I mean, it's a non-starter on its face. I mean, this is a massive, massive footprint. What's the problem? It's low power density. It's one reason why I'll put my marker out here. If we're serious about reducing CO2 emissions, we have to be serious about nuclear energy. And unfortunately, we need bipartisan buy-in for nuclear, and we don't have that. We see that here in New York, where the Indian Point reactors, the first one will close in April of next year. The reactor 3 will close in April of 2022. This is a massive mistake in terms of CO2 emissions. It's a massive mistake in terms of land use. To replace Indian Point, which covers 1 square kilometer, you would need 1,300 square kilometers of wind turbines. So the land use issue, in my view, is the great disconnect here. And it relies on what I call the vacant land myth, this idea that there is lots of just empty land out there in flyover country that's ready and waiting to be covered with renewable energy stuff. It's simply not true. Honolulu Times this morning reported over 24 people arrested just last night blocking a highway on the island of Oahu to protest a proposed wind energy project. That follows 55 arrests that happened day before yesterday. The fact is that the expansion of wind energy is meeting resistance all across this country. A couple of weeks ago in Madison County, Iowa, famous for the bridges of Madison County, passed a moratorium, 1-year moratorium on new wind energy projects. I've been tracking this for close to 5 years. Since 2015, over 240 government entities from Maine to California have passed resolutions or rejected or restricted wind projects. This includes California, where it's effectively impossible to build new wind capacity. That's Kamala Harris's home state. Vermont, Bernie Sanders, who's now repeatedly come out in favor of 100% renewables. You can't build new wind energy capacity in Vermont. Same in Massachusetts, Elizabeth Warren's home state. So the scale issue here is probably the most formidable issue in terms of thinking about any kind of energy transition. And how we overcome that, I think, is going to be a key challenge. And it's not just about wind energy siting, high voltage transmission lines. The state of Arkansas, state of New Hampshire, state of New Hampshire, Arkansas, Iowa, and Missouri all have blocked high voltage transmission projects in the last few years. So when we talk about renewable energy, one of the fundamental problems, and I see a much brighter future, brighter, in fact, for solar than I do for wind. Why? Because where the wind energy resource is where the people ain't. And you've got to move it. And if you're going to have to build, according to National Renewable Energy Laboratory, double existing high voltage transmission capacity to get to 90% renewable electricity, I think that's going to be a non-starter in terms of land use across the country. So let's not, scale is really the key issue when it comes to talking about these issues, in addition to cost, power density, energy density, and so on.
Thank you so much. Dan, do you want to come in?
I would. So, Robert kind of reminds me of the person in the parking lot before a long hike towards a far up mountain range that is wisely explaining all the reasons that we're going to die and not get there. And it's easy to take the straw man of the resolution.
It's nice here in the parking lot.
I'm trying to make it fun, right?
I like it here in the parking lot. It's beautiful here.
It's easy to take the straw man of the marquee AOC resolution and question a bunch of it. I think we all have questions about how quickly we can get there, and we can get into those at any time. I would point out three things just from your point. One, we agree totally on the issue of permitting. So both for years and years, conservatives have been concerned about regulation, permitting, and I think more and more progressives need to understand that unless we fix regulation and permitting to get whatever kind of new power plants going, we're going to have to figure that out together. And again, that's another reason I emphasize the community bottom-up level, because I think people need to figure out how to get the outcomes they want in their communities and deal with some of the state and regulatory permitting challenges that are out there, because these systems don't work too well. In terms of nuclear, I would say the following, because it's an important question to raise. So, you're right, we've about 1,000 gigawatts of capacity, 1 terawatt capacity. Nuclear is about 10% by capacity more, about 15 to 20% by generation. We want to keep that online as much as possible, but going back to my framework, we need to figure out, ultimately, I'm a jigger shog on the debate around subsidy-free energy. In the long run, we need to phase out subsidies. We've been subsidizing oil and gas for a century. We've been subsidizing nuclear principally through the Price-Anderson Act of 1952, which was designed to make it basically taxpayers, and this is still true today, are on the hook for a nuclear accident, for the cost of nuclear accident. So if advanced nuclear is safe, that subsidy should be removed. I would have no problem with it. Go ask the nuclear industry if they're ready for that. I don't know the answer to the question. I could guess. And then on the land use question, because I'm talking too much, I'd like to come back to that, because I think there are counter studies to what you've suggested, sir.
Thank you so much. Jonathan, do you want to come in?
Well, you alluded to a question in your intro that I think is absolutely important, which is how urgent is this problem? And therein lies one of the inherent challenges. If you are going to re-engineer our energy economy, which I see every reason to believe that we need to do based on the science that is coming out, that is not a get it done in 10 years kind of a deal. That is a very massive undertaking that requires, yes, the mobilization of capital, technology, deployment of what we've got now, flexibility to enable and frankly to incent the development of new low carbon technologies, especially for those parts of our economy that are harder to abate. And there's some very important work that one of my colleagues at the Center on Global Energy Policy just put out on industrial heating as one of the real stinker issues that we have to get our heads around. So it's really urgent, but it requires a sobriety of approach. We must think about cost. We must think about less costly solutions first, because we're going to be at this for a while. But having said all of that, we do not have the luxury of sitting around and waiting for perfection. We have to do today, Dan's deployment PN, which I totally agree with, we have to do today that which we can, and we will not have the time to look for perfection. We have to, though, be sensible in figuring out in which order to tackle how much.
Thank you so much. As we look around the world in responses to the Green New Deal, we have the new EC President-elect von der Leyen calling for a European Green Deal within the first 100 days of her presidency. Europe, of course, is sort of the spiritual heartland of all things ESG and environment, but interesting that she has responded in kind to a US policy. As we look around the world, I'd love to have your insight on what are policies that have worked, what are policies that haven't necessarily worked. We had the great question on Finland earlier. Certainly within the Eurozone and other countries such as Canada, there seems to be very much a focus on the national level or the federal level as opposed to a state or municipal level that you alluded to, Dan. So what's worked and what hasn't?
Well, look, I think that one of the theological or at least philosophical challenges that confronts us when we look at the Green New Deal is that for some, Green New Deal is a call to move away from market solutions to the problems that we face. And I think that you can see lots of examples where that impulse has not worked. Look at the feed-in tariff story in Europe, where yes, you can say that the effect of it was to reduce to subsidize the application of wind and solar, chiefly in the German economy, but that has proved incredibly burdensome. You look at what has happened then with feed-in tariffs in Spain and Portugal, where basically they had to renegotiate after some time because they could not any longer afford those instruments. Using market instruments wherever possible, and whether it's auctions, for example, for renewables capacity, what have you, is very important. A second critically important element that we need to keep space for is flexibility. I disagree with pieces of what Robert said earlier, but where I very much agree with him is that we are painting ourselves into a corner if we think we can solve 100% of our climate problem with wind and solar. Wind and solar are not effective to address the industrial heat and other hard-to-abate sectors of our economy. Wind and solar, when you get into the very high proportions, you see the costs just go through the roof. And here I call to people's attention the work that my former boss, Secretary Moniz, and his colleagues at the Energy Futures Initiative did in looking at the decarbonization objectives of the state of California with and without flexibility in terms of what the no carbon future would consist of. We must build in flexibility. I'll stop there.
So I very much agree that wind and solar is not going to get there. I totally agree that the market is sending a lot of signals in terms of scale, whether the shift in allocations. Alexis, you had a great article recently on funds that are putting billions of dollars into ESG and looking for investments around the world. I think the market is certainly speaking in the U.S. around coal. I think the potential for the right mix of renewables and storage and microgrids, which I think we're going to see to be a critical thing to solve both the transportation need and the resilience needs. Look at what's going on in California with the PG&E new normal out there, where 1 million people are cut off because you can debate whose fault it is and how much it's going to cost, but we're talking about a $50 billion problem in terms of liability. There's going to be fires. Do you keep the transformers on or not? And that's going to lead to microgrid and innovation and more smaller scale piece of work like that. In terms of your international question, I would throw out sustainable infrastructure, and procurement of them. I think Canada, UK, Australia, there's a number of places that actually look at this as we're buying 40, 50-year assets, be it seawalls or anything else, and U.S. procurement at the state and local level is the low-cost capital bid with no plan for maintaining the life cycle asset. There's a playbook to fix that, and whether you're in the adaptation business or the mitigation business, it's going to save us a ton of money to get that right. And we could do that way better in the US, and we're gonna, whatever level of trillion you want to spend on roads and bridges and putting them in the wrong place, or wastewater treatment plants or putting them in the wrong place and making sure that we have a way to pay for them, we do not do a good job. And oftentimes, if you pick the life cycle slightly more expensive solution, it is the press that whacks you for, oh, you didn't pick the low-cost capital bit. So there's a lot of work to be done around procurement, politics, and how we cover that.
Thank you so much. Robert, you sit in one state, which geographically is interesting because I think if Texas were a country, it would be the 5th largest wind power just after France and Spain. And then equally is enjoying this nat gas boom. So as you look around the world, there are other countries like the UAE, which has potentially the largest solar field. Are there other countries that have a blended approach, which are admirable and potentially great for the US?
Well, Texas is often referred to whenever wind energy comes up. Well, let me assure you, Texas is not the US, all right? Be thankful. There are relatively wide open spaces, relatively unpopulated places in Texas where you can get a lot of wind energy capacity. Also, the grid in Texas is isolated and it is heavily oriented toward natural gas. So blending wind into Texas is not the same as doing it in other locations around the world. But the question is around the world. So I've spent the last 3 years, I just finished a book, finished a documentary on electricity. They'll be out in the next few months. I went to India, Iceland, Lebanon, Puerto Rico, Colorado, New York. What did I see? I saw people will do whatever they have to do to get the energy they need, in particular when it comes to electricity. So in India, they're heavily reliant on coal, and they're going to continue relying on coal for a long time to come because that's the resource that they have. But to Dan's point on microgrids, outside of Beirut in the Shuf Mountains, at a resort called Kirzai, saw a perfectly working microgrid. Chinese solar panels charging lead-acid batteries that were designed in Bulgaria and manufactured in India. So this is a global supply chain. So this is a global problem. It's not Texas warming, it's not New York warming, it's global climate change, right? So how do we address this globally? I think obviously it's going to have to be with more technology that reduces the cost, in particular of electricity, because this is the world's fastest growing and most important form of energy. But we can also look around the world to the places where there is friction. And I understand your point, Dan, about permitting, but when we look at Germany, which has arguably taken the most aggressive steps internationally to change their energy and power systems, the wind energy business there is collapsing. Again, why? Because of land use conflicts. So in the first half of this year, new wind capacity additions down 80% compared to last year. And in Norway, the wind energy business has effectively been shut down again because of local opposition. Why? There's this term NIMBY. I think that's a slur. People who live out in rural areas, rural landowners, rural homeowners, they care about the place that they live. And they didn't move out there to look at 400 or 500 foot high wind turbines and see red blinking lights all night, every night, and be affected by the noise created by these turbines. And that is an emerging issue. The World Health Organization issued a report last year, said there are particularly strong negative attitudes in populations living in the vicinity of wind turbines. That's the World Health Organization. They also talked about noise. And I've interviewed people all over the world, some in the last few weeks, who've moved out of their homes after having wind turbines built near them because of the noise problem. Now, the wind industry downplays this issue. It is a serious concern. It is a health risk. And they say at the World Health Organization, there are serious issues with noise exposure assessment related to wind turbines. These are emerging issues that I think are going to hamper the growth of that industry. And I don't see any way around them because, again, land use, power density issues that are basically rooted in fundamental physics.
Right, but Robert, if I might jump in, I mean,
sure.
The land use issues are not uniquely a problem of the wind industry, right?
Perfectly agree. Sure.
There are different versions of that everywhere, and I bet you there are a lot of people.
Pipelines are another example. Sure.
There are lots of people living around Indian Point who are pretty darn happy about its closure. I happen to agree with your point that is a net loser for moving in the direction of the low carbon economy that we need. But I think that we have to recognize that these problems apply to the zero carbon future and to everything else.
Sure.
And then we need a conversation that engages on them seriously to figure out how do we deal with them.
And it's an incredibly difficult problem. How do you compensate the people that are living near these projects? And I live in Texas. There's a big fight over the pipeline, Kinder Morgan, a gas pipeline that is going through the town of Buda and Kyle. They're fighting it tooth and nail.
You know, so if I could, I mean, I think back to my fourth, scorecard item, which is metrics. I mean, we do have to watch in this conversation, how do we avoid the tyranny of the anecdote? Because I think we can all pick individual points around what's wrong or why it's not going to scale, et cetera. I mean, if you pull back in terms of what is the challenge at hand, if we don't have to agree whether humans cause the situation we have. I think most people would agree that we have a problem. We have weird weather. We have rising sea level. We're looking at a half of a billion refugees in the year 2100. The U.S. military is concerned. Arguably, the Syria crisis was caused by a water crisis. So we have to figure stuff out. The question is, how do we go faster? Not necessarily what the 10-year limit is. And to my friends in the environmental community, I often say, what's the cost of losing? I get that you're feeling urgent. I get that you feel there's a crisis. But if you overreach politically and lose, are you measuring that time loss? For some, for those old enough to remember, 2009, there was an attempt to do cap and trade under President Obama. There was a bipartisan coalition at the Senate at the time that would have gladly passed a national RPS, which I think is a good policy, a $3 oil price floor that would be generating revenue for renewable R&D right now. So understanding what you can get politically, working at it from the bottom up, working at it in terms of international partnerships from the top down, and trying to emphasize common ground is, I think, my biggest critique of the Green New Deal resolution, because it's like, this is the plan, and it has to be iterative, it has to be mindful and do all the math of what you can actually get done.
And market-oriented, as Jonathan pointed out. A lot of this is hinged upon technology. So just looking at, let's just even think about power generation. Robert, you've just done your work on power generation and also your book on technologies. And we think about the use of fuel or renewables, either powering electricity, increasingly in demand around the world, as well as looking at transportation. Can you talk us through some of the costs and benefits of alternative sources of fuel? So we touched on a little bit on nuclear, or even looking to carbon capture. Energy efficiency is the fifth fuel. In the whole array, where would you see the highest costs and benefits?
Let me answer that in a way that, well, it addresses that to some degree, but it's, again, back to the scale question. So what have I been writing about for the last 10 years? Natural gas and nuclear. If we're serious about scaling low carbon technologies, what are the ones that are available now that are low carbon, scalable, relatively low cost, and can be internationalized? Well, the natural gas and the fracking revolution has led to this incredible abundance of natural gas in the United States, so that now we're exporting LNG, get this, to Kuwait and the United Arab Emirates. I mean, this is coal to Newcastle, ice to Eskimos, I don't know. I mean, the fact that we're exporting gas from Texas and the Louisiana Gulf Coast halfway around the world, it's remarkable. Because 7 years ago, Lee Raymond, who was then CEO and chairman of ExxonMobil, said, there's no more natural gas to be found in the US, we have to build the Arctic gas pipeline. So what's happening today? Gas from Texas and Oklahoma and Louisiana is competing with coal-fired generation in Japan and diesel engines in China. I mean, this is a remarkable turn of events, and this is very positive. And when you look at the scale of the increase in gas compared to the scale of solar, for instance, last year alone, gas production globally increased by 3.3 million barrels of oil equivalent per day in 1 year. That's greater than the contribution of all global solar at 2.7 million. And that includes I have solar panels on the roof of my house in Austin. I mean, these are staggering numbers. So what is happening is America kind of stumbled into this, truly, and now this lower carbon fuel is proliferating around the world. That's a very positive development. It's one due to technological innovation that's not generally considered part of the renewable crowd, or the renewable suite.
Thank you. Dan, coming to you, and can you also just touch a little bit upon the reduction in the cost of solar and wind?
Sure.
Help the audience get a grasp of that.
Just to pick up from what Robert was saying, I think I will address your question, which is an important part of being a panelist. There's no doubt that natural gas is an important transition fuel compared to coal. The question is, and this comes down to policy. So left to its own, as the Arctic melts, will it get cheaper to pull oil and gas out of there, and is that a good idea or not? That's a question for policy. I happen to think not. But in terms of understanding where the market is going, in last year alone, 2019, we had 8 gigawatts of retirement from coal. We had 24 gigawatts addition, 46% wind, 34% gas, 18% solar. So even the market is shifting, I think, a little bit to, is gas the right way to go? And I think most importantly, from my perspective, as we look at what, if we're going to solve this problem, it's going to take top down and bottom up. And at the community level, what is community scale infrastructure? What are the resources you have? Should Germany be in the wind and solar business versus Texas? Not based on natural conditions, right? So I think part of it is how we can rationalize the pricing and the strategy around this to really emphasize it would be great if we could pass national laws that are in far-reaching basis in 2021 and beyond. I wouldn't bet the whole farm on it.
If I could jump in on that, I mean, I just, with a colleague at the Center on Global Energy Policy, released a piece on the natural gas story looking forward. And I think Robert's points are valid and important. The natural gas industry has generated incredible and important benefits for working people, for urban air quality, and for climate benefits over the last decade. The challenge is that the next decade going forward will not be the last decade. And so there are some profound issues around the future of natural gas that the oil and gas industry needs to confront now, because we will not have room in the carbon budget to keep on burning that gas. Now, is it a better answer than massive amounts of coal being burned in developing countries and in those parts of the OECD countries that are still using it? Yes, it is, of course, a better answer, not least because it reduces the urban air quality assaults, which are killing people in the here and now by the millions. But if we fail to take account of the fact that we don't really understand the extent of leakage from the value chain for natural gas, if we fail to take account of the fact that there is massive quantities of flaring including prominently in the Permian Basin in Texas, then we are missing a really strategically important part of the story. So where we go forward is an important question. To the wind and solar story, it is absolutely dramatic that now we have a situation where in certain locations, under certain cases, the levelized cost of electricity, which is an imperfect metric for reasons that we can get into later, the LCOE cost of new onshore wind and utility scale solar capacity can be below that of existing coal-fired power plants and new combined cycle gas turbines. Now, there's an operative word there, which is can. It depends a lot on the setting. The LCOE does not well account for the intermittency issue, which is where you end up getting into additional capital costs that you have to contend with, whether it's for grid modernization and or for whether it's battery storage or some other backstopping technology. But look, the pace of change in this space has been eye-popping, and it ought to give us not a sense that automatically all of our problems will be solved, but it ought to give us a sense of optimism that we can actually see clean energy solutions that will really alter the landscape.
Thank you. So we're seeing a huge cost. Yeah?
Can I just jump in real quick? So one of the most interesting headlines that I've seen in the last few months is Shell Oil announcing they want to be the biggest electricity generator in the world by the 2030s. So they're looking at their portfolio, they're very long nat gas and LNG, so they're looking at at arbitraging their position in LNG into the electricity market. Now, to what extent they'll succeed, we'll see. But I think that, I take your point about the oil industry and it needs to do more. Just to your point on the Permian Basin, today in the Permian, they're flaring 600 million cubic feet of gas per day. They're flaring it, just burning it. 600 million cubic feet a day is equal to the gas consumption of Portugal or Chile. I mean, this is a massive quantity of gas that's just being wasted. It's indicative of the vast resource in the Permian, but I think, to your point, I mean, this is crazy town. The fact that much valuable resource is being wasted.
So, but we are seeing a return on investment, though, in terms of private capital, I think, in the renewable space, and then also just looking to the energy companies, the original Seven Sisters, where you mentioned Shell, and there's certainly a couple of other French, British companies that are investing in EV and solar around the world. So certainly there seems to be a drive by both cost and customer. Thinking about the feasibility of the policy as a whole, one thing I think that has united Democrats and Republicans left and right on the energy issue is this prospect of energy independence. And this has been something that's been motioned on the Hill for decades and talked about. And so in this whole future, I would say, which we might say is a transition involving other parts of energy, not just foreign oil and gas, also domestic, how feasible is U.S. energy independence? Jonathan, we'll start with you.
It doesn't exist. I mean, we are part of global markets. We want to be part of global markets. We are not independent. We are not able to operate outside of that. I commented earlier on some of the price impacts on wind and solar that came from Germany's choice to use the feed-in tariff that would guarantee very favorable returns for early investors. Germany made that choice. We all benefited from it, in part because of international trade. The same is true for all other parts of our global energy economy. Now, that's not to say that there are not benefits. Too many triple, double, quadruple negatives there. There are benefits that, of course, come from having domestically produced energy. Balance of payments is an obvious one. Domestic employment, also obvious and critically important. So there are reasons why we ought to want to develop, where it makes economic sense, our own energy resources of a variety of sorts. But to pretend that we exist somehow, or might in some future exist, separate from the rest of the global energy economy, it doesn't happen.
Thank you. Dan?
So I guess I would answer the question this way. So for many, many years, our dependence on foreign oil was just a huge part of American foreign policy and the dialogue around energy. As Robert pointed out, we had this natural gas revolution. During the Obama era, we had sort of all of the above as the new energy strategy. I think what I'm hearing in agreement is all of the above if the numbers, pencil on both price and on low carbon metrics. I think ultimately where communities are going around the country is towards a notion of community resilience, both for their economy and their energy supply. And so do you want to, if you're living in the new normal of California, you already know what the challenges are. If your economy is dependent on supply chains that are too big or transmission lines that are too long, I think more and more people are going to be looking for this idea of resilience in their energy and their economy. I don't know what it looks like right now, but I think that will be both something that will bring people together on a bipartisan level, at the bipartisan basis on the local level, but I think it will sort of drive a little bit of where the energy conversation is going to go.
Thank you. Robert?
Well, thank you for asking that question. My third book was called Gusher of Lies, The Dangerous Delusions of Energy Independence. So I'm clear about this idea of energy independence.
Glad I didn't go for that one.
Yeah, but we live, to Jonathan's point, we live in an interdependent world in everything, whether it's, beer and wine or gasoline or tennis rackets, you name it. Who's dependent? Is the buyer dependent on the seller, or is the seller dependent on the buyer? Well, they meet in the middle and they both benefit by exchanging goods. So what I do see, though, and I think I agree with Jonathan, it's been a boon to the American economy, been a boon to the American consumer, having this reduction in price for both oil and natural gas. The questions that I think are emerging now in terms of this globalization and the push toward more green technologies is, okay, well, from where will we get the rare earth elements, the praseodymium, neodymium, and lanthanum, other things that are required in every Prius, every high output electric motor? Where will we get the lithium? Where will we source all these things? There was a very interesting letter that was sent to the British government in June by Richard Harrington of the Museum of Natural History in London, pointing out this effort to electrify all of British transport and what it would require. I had a piece in the New York Post about this just a little while ago, or I'm sorry, it was in The Hill, pointing out taking Harrington's numbers to electrify transportation in the United States would require something on the order of 4 times global copper production, all global copper production to electrify US transport, and 18 times global cobalt production. Cobalt's a very problematic metal. So we live in an interdependent world, and if, for one country to say, well, we're going to do all in on this, well, it means depending on the supply chains that are global, like I saw in the Shuf Mountains in Lebanon. I mean, this is a global business.
I just want to add on to that. So one of the things that California did under Governor Brown was passed a buy clean law, because just to further amplify this point, whether sourcing precious metals, something like 15 to 20% of California emissions was embedded in the products that they buy. So this was a first step, far to go, but it's an interesting chunk of policy like industrial energy efficiency and the pie chart of actions that we need to take along with renewables that I think is an area of policy, like what's embedded in what you buy and what can be done to change that. And in some cases, do you have cleaner and greener or more efficient production at home as the global supply chain maybe contracts a little bit in this new era? That policy set, I think you'll see more and more.
Thank you. And I think it's also interesting to point out one of the key things in the Green New Deal as a whole is about innovation and creating jobs. And I think what's interesting is we're talking about the exchange of goods and physical goods around the world as it relates to oil and nat gas or solar panels, but the other concept of cross-border innovation and where the best innovation comes from in terms of efficiency. So with that, we will turn to the floor for questions. May I please ask you to identify yourself and then two things. One, to limit yourself to a question. And secondly, just to note that we are going to focus on the debt sustainability in the next panel, so really to focus more on the environment here.
Diane Baker, community member. What role does conservation play in your evaluation of energy needs?
Number one.
Yeah.
Amory Lovin's megawatts. Go look it up.
Yeah, I mean, just one liner. You said fifth fuel. Why isn't it the first? I mean, the energy productivity, getting the most use out of the energy that we do use and figuring out how to avoid the use of energy ought to be where we start.
Robert?
I don't waste any energy. I'm sure all of you do. I always use just the right amount, and you all are energy profligates. This is one of the issues with energy efficiency, and Amory Lovins and the negawatts, well, look up Jevons Paradox, which shows that, and this is a book that was published in 1865 by the world's first energy economist. He found that, in fact, when you become more efficient, you don't use less energy, you use more. And a house was built 2 doors down from mine. They just finished it. There are 46 exterior lights. All of them are LEDs, I'm sure. 46, I counted them. So we are getting more efficient, dramatically more efficient. But one of the things is we're using what we have more. And a couple of quick points. This summer, we set a record for gas. Our auto fleet in the United States is dramatically more efficient today than it was, right? But we're still driving SUVs. Gasoline demand this summer hit a record 9.9 million barrels per day. This summer, Americans flew more this summer for the 10th year in a row. Air travel was up 3.4% this year. Our airliners are more efficient. We're flying more. We're also eating more meat. This idea of efficiency. Great, let's eat less meat. Red meat and poultry consumption's a record per capita levels, 222 pounds last year. So this idea that we're going to use less, well, I'm in favor of you all using less, but I'm just using just the right amount.
Sounds to me, Robert, like you're making a strong case for aggressive new policies.
Well, look, what I'm trying to underscore is, look, efficiency is great, and we're getting more efficient. There's no question. But let's remember that around the world, there are 3 billion people who are still living in dire energy poverty.
Right. Look at the statistics from the energy savings of the Department of Energy and EPA regulations on refrigerators. It is a staggering amount of electricity that we have saved. So you've got today a situation where the interior capacity of those refrigerators is far greater than it was in the 1970s when these regulations were first put in practice, and the energy use is a fraction. So, I mean, there's huge work to be done here. Rollbacks such as one has seen on lamps, which evidently make you look orange, or vehicles, et cetera, are exactly the wrong way for us to be moving.
Thank you so much. Can we take 2 questions in the interest of time?
Yeah, Craig Mullett, early stage investor. I wonder if the panel can comment on innovation, both on the generation side as well as the efficiency side. Which areas do you see the most scope, and maybe some examples? Thanks.
Thank you.
Hello. I've had an opportunity to live on 3 continents, Africa and Europe and North America. My question is, in the dialogue around energy and the environment, I feel that there is a strong case to be made for looking towards, for instance, people who live in African villages to stand up as a bit of a education to the rest of the world. So my question is, to what extent is it necessary to open up the discussion about the Green New Deal? I really am working towards a green, diverse, and inclusive new peace deal. Thank you.
Thank you so much. So firstly on innovation, who wants to start?
On innovation, I'll throw out one, and I think there'll probably be agreement around it. So, the carbon capture issue and the new products that can be created potentially with carbon, some of which are being tested now, and efforts like net power. I mean, it's always good to have a plan B. So the smart people, and it's bipartisan, environmentalists, that by the year 2100, if we're not already dead, we're going to have to take out about 15% of carbon from the atmosphere, or else we're going to be for dead sure. And so there is a very, I think, important set of activities that are going on down there. I like the products and capture at the site, particularly if you're dealing with coal growth in India and China, as opposed to pipelines to Permian Basin, because they got to get their flaring done first. But that would be my innovation point.
First of all, Plan B, I don't think that CCUS is Plan B. I think it's Plan right now. Move ahead on innovation there, because we need that as another tool in the toolkit. In fact, the real point on innovation is we need all the tools in the toolkit. And we need, I think, innovation not only in terms of the hardware, but also in thinking through how do we execute a transition, right? So we have natural gas going through lots of pipelines today. Is there a future in which, on a cost-effective, competitive basis, we have other fuels such as hydrogen, ideally renewably produced, or zero carbon produced, going through those pipelines? How do we think about that? What business model changes does that require? So the innovation question, I think, is hugely important. But it's across the board, and I think that's the other piece I would emphasize.
Well, I'll address the Africa question. You look at the numbers today, United States, 330 million people. We consume more solar electricity than 1.1 billion Africans. So the inequality globally in terms of energy consumption is profound. My new book, my new documentary, the book is called A Question of Power, out March 10th. You don't have to read it, you just have to buy it. There are 3 billion people today on this planet who live in locations where per capita electricity consumption is less than what's consumed by my refrigerator, which is an Energy Star refrigerator. 1,000 kilowatt hours per year is roughly what my refrigerator uses. This is the defining inequality of our time. And how we address that energy poverty globally is going to determine, and how particularly the electricity part of it, is going to determine our effectiveness ultimately, I think, in the global challenge of CO2 emissions. But it's not just about CO2 emissions, it's also about bringing women and girls into opportunity where they can get an education and just addressing this fundamental inequity. So we have to be laser focused on electricity, and I'm very optimistic.
I want to make a joke, but I mean it seriously. It's almost, I think this panel is successful because Robert is basically working on the first draft of AOC's International Green New Deal, because I agree with all of your points.
Thank you. Next question, please.
I didn't know I was, but thank you. Yeah, that's good.
My name is Abe Stilzaft, a community member. The name of the this segment was Energy and the Environment. You focused on production and supply. I want to ask, I think, which are interrelated questions. One, my guess is it's behind what you were talking about a lot, is number one on the what's called externalities of energy production. And you didn't throw that out there. And it's a nice term, you know, it does talk what really happens to communities and individuals who have to face certain environments that is energy heavy or production heavy. And the second one was on conservation itself. Again, I think, if I'm not mistaken, I think Dan just threw something out there about it. But, and also the whole issue about we should all be energy aware ourselves. For those who were around in '73, I think it was nice seeing Carter wear a sweater, but outside of talking about individual responsibility, what did that really do? And I understand individual responsibility, but it's really a policy question. How do you guys incorporate, how would you like to see incorporated the question of externalities and conservation in the different ways that you would see how we would move forward on energy production and supply? Thank you.
Thank you so much, James.
Quick response there. I mean, my favorite answer is put a price on carbon, get it done today, get it moving. That won't address all of the need to drive efficiency and conservation in our economy, but it's a good start. We will still need regulatory instruments. You know, people criticize CAFE all the time. We'll need, if you don't like CAFE, come up with a better answer. We need regulations to go along with policy, but that is all about, putting a price on carbon is all about addressing those externalities. The problem is, and here I go back to my first three framing comments, it continues to be extraordinarily hard, and so people end up using a bunch, for perfectly good reasons, a bunch of second best from an economics standpoint tools. I hope that we will soon be placing a price on carbon because we need it.
I'll answer it two ways. I'll refer back to my 4 M's because I'm a nerd. So on the metrics question, I hope you...
That's not an M.
Huh?
That's not an M, nerd.
M? Oh, well, M it. On the metrics question, I would ask you, and the externalities question, I hope you come up and ask Douglas Holtz-Eakin that question because I don't think I would give him an A for his doing all the math on the externalities in his cost estimate. And then I do think on the conservation question, and I'm glad you brought up Jimmy Carter. I mean, part of this is a messaging issue because I think when we get the right price signals, that's one thing. There are huge challenges for you know, U.S. consumption generally versus Africa and other places. But I think in terms of encouraging people, how do you do it in a way that you just don't get hammered? Whether, you know, obviously the rollout of the New Deal in terms of everyone, you know, is not going to be able to eat meat and all that kind of stuff. You know, again, I think that as fundamentally fractured at times as our politics are, I think the media could do a better job of this as well. So, but I think it's fundamentally a messaging challenge.
Thank you. Next question, please.
Thank you. Roger Mesnick, Columbia Business School. First, I wanted to bring up the issue of our efficiency in utilizing existing resources. The question was raised already. I just want to add one statistic which may be of interest. The amount of energy per dollar GDP consumed in the United States compared to Europe is roughly on the order of twice as much. So we surely have a lot yet to do in terms of efficiency here compared to other countries that have a comparable standard of living, let's say. With respect to Germany, I was disappointed in a sense to see that the experiments that Germany did was declared to be a loss and to be declared to be a bad experiment. Actually, part of it had to do with the fact that no one could foresee at the time that the contracts were signed what the rate of technological progress was going to be. So the contracts were, in a sense, signed under then existing conditions. But furthermore, more interestingly, there's some recent development which may matter quite a lot. Quite a number of very large German enterprises managed to escape the surcharge that was imposed on energy consumption. And the German government is currently considering some lawsuits which may raise up to 20 to 25 billion euro from these firms that managed to escape this arrangement. So that's quite an interesting side effect. Addressing Mr. Bryce, we hear very often all these scary numbers that you enumerated for us. It seems to me, however, that there is an issue of unfairness here, because the alternative to the numbers that you are quoting, however large they are, is not doing nothing. The alternative is what will happen if we don't do something. And I wish that someone would take a little bit of time to enumerate for us some of the costs that would arise if we didn't do all these things that you said would cost X trillion dollars here and there. And that would be the issue that I think that would be the base for a reasonable comparison.
Thank you. Robert, do you want to come in?
The first thing Germany should not do is close its nuclear plants. And yet, that's what they're doing. Second, what are they doing to deal with then their electricity needs? They're continuing and even opening new lignite-fired power plants. So these are the facts. I mean, we can disagree about what the numbers and so on, but I think Roger Pilkey Jr. coined this iron law of energy policy, which is countries will embrace climate policy until it starts to affect economic growth, and they will choose economic growth every time. And that's what you've seen in Germany, where the middle stand and the large industrial users have been exempted from the energy surcharges, so all of the energy costs of the energy Wende, for the electricity side anyway, are falling on residential customers. So, to what extent, I'm not claiming to be an expert on what's happening in Germany, but this is the reality. And so residential customers are getting hit hard. There is a disparity between energy consumption in the US and in Europe. Yeah, sure, I live in Texas. So, I live around people that drive big pickups and they like them. And are we gonna make them illegal? I don't think so. But here in New York, you have the lowest per capita CO2 emissions of any state in the country. Correct. Why is it? Because we're in New York. People live on top of each other, right? Not the case in Buda, Texas.
The other thing to point out, I think, which is interesting, we haven't touched upon, is the extent to which carbon emissions are associated with old industrial manufacturing growth, and that you have a reduction in carbon emissions when you have a more services-oriented economy. So I would look at New York as being a predominantly services-oriented economy.
Yeah, not much manufacturing here.
I wanted to address your second point that Robert didn't address. I mean, I think this issue of measuring, doing all the math, measuring the cost of inaction, the risk, et cetera, I think the market is starting to speak on this all over the world in terms of stranded assets, in terms of where things are going, et cetera. So while I wish that the public dialogue would do all the math so we understand what these costs are, I think the market is addressing them.
And by the way, I didn't mean to cast aspersions on Germany's choices. Germany's choices had both strong and weaker sides, and that is perfectly evident in hindsight, right? So among the favorable sides of it was deployment at greater scale, which had the effect of accelerating the learning curve, the technology of learning, and reducing costs.
Not just in Germany.
For the entire world. And by the way, I mean, on the existing resources point, I encourage everybody in the room who thinks that we're doing just fine with our energy transformation to look at the Sankey diagrams that come out. That's a kind of input-output diagram that comes out of Lawrence Berkeley National Laboratory, I think every year. That shows, and I'm embarrassed that I can't actually cite the percentage, but it's been a while since I looked myself, rejected energy, namely energy which is not used for productive output, amounts to something north of 2/3 of the primary energy consumption. I mean, and that's for the United States, which is, let's review, an advanced economy. So we ought to be cringing seeing those diagrams every year.
Thank you so much.
Hi, thank you. Chris Russell, Project 77. We're in EdTech in the Columbia Startup Lab. My question is net zero emissions the right paradigm to operate in? And kind of my question for climate change anyways, kind of my question is that really the only solution? Like, why do you think there is geoengineering solutions that we should take seriously? Increasing capacity of the, Earth's albedo, things of that nature. And the only parallel I can think of is the last catastrophe we really had was carrying capacity, where we thought, we don't have enough food supply to support the world's population. And there were two groups in this camp. One was reduced population, the other is increased supply of food. So is carbon emissions net zero, that paradigm more, the preventative, or there are other geoengineering solutions that do look promising?
Thanks so much. There's sort of two questions, probably. One on the geoengineering adaptation. We touched upon Bill Gates, hurricane alterations, et cetera. And then maybe, Robert, you would handle the one on scarcity of resources and other crises.
Well, let's see. Just quickly on the net zero, I want to touch on that. I mean, I think as a paradigm, it makes some sense. It's obviously important that we need to do better on the built environment. Focusing on that paradigm rather than its better building codes, where I think we could nail a lot more outcomes, would be something that I would certainly prefer as a way to think about that piece. In terms of the geoengineering stuff, again, I'm not an either-or kind of guy. I'm an and-both kind of guy. I do think that the research piece is important and the potential here is important, but not if, here we are in an important meeting with lots of smart people, and three of the smartest people have said, what about efficiency, what about efficiency, what about efficiency? So the extent that it takes our eyes off what we can do now, I think we just need to be careful. I know many of us are all excited about 5G, but if you go to a rural area, we don't even have 1G. So I think we have a tendency to go for the new thing. And I think people will chase that, and there are people doing that I respect, but at the end of the day, where do I have a resilient community? Where do I get my power? How does this work for the 50 miles around me? That's the world in which a lot of these power decisions need to be made.
Well, I'll just make one quick point, which is net zero, it's aspirational. Are we going to achieve it? I think the answer is clearly no. We're going to have to adapt. Regardless of what we're going to face with climate change, hotter, colder, more extreme, we're going to need a whole lot more energy. And if you look at the IEA's latest data, last year electricity demand globally grew 4%. That means it's doubling every 18 years. In India, air conditioning demand is growing 12% per year, meaning it's doubling every 6 years. So if we're facing, it appears, this more extreme weather events, we need a heck of a lot more energy than we're using now. And the fact that renewables right now aren't even keeping pace with existing demand growth, I just don't see net zero as within the realm of possibility. And I don't take any joy in that, but I just don't see the deployment of zero carbon alternatives, in particular nuclear, scaling fast enough to make that kind of a difference in a world where we're using 270 million barrels of oil equivalent per day.
Well, as they remind us in every ad from every brokerage, past performance does not indicate future returns. The problem with relying too carefully on analyses such as come out from the Energy Information Administration or International Energy Agency is that those are based on presumptions about a kind of a set of policies currently existing. And this conversation that we're having is all about the need to change policies in order to bend the curve. So if I were asked whether I'm optimistic today about our success in getting to the climate solutions we need based on available data, I could not give you a sense of optimism. But I'm also not willing to be as pessimistic as Robert just was a second ago, because what is changing here is also the interaction between society and the scientific information as it is presented to them. So we need to take seriously the scale of this problem.
Thank you so much. We may just take two questions.
I apologize, Mr. Bryce, for picking on you, but you're on this conference.
Go ahead.
One of the things I've not heard discussed is there's a tremendous millions of square feet of rooftops, both industrial and residential, which are not used, which could be doing either solar and or hot water. So I haven't heard any discussion of that. The other thing is that 8 years ago, I was in a talk at the University of Delaware where one of the professors who was studying wind turbines had done calculations based upon wind data on the East Coast. And he said, based on his calculations, if you put wind turbines up and down the East Coast, you could supply enough electricity for the entire country just on that coast. So would you like to comment on those, please?
Sure.
Thank you, and we'll just take one last question.
Michael Lee here. Just want to get the panel's thoughts on oil and gas infrastructure investing, specifically related to pipeline, building new pipelines. Great opposition to building new pipelines are environmental issues, and also on the thesis of if we're migrating to renewable, 100% renewable by 2050, we should kind of start allocating more investment to renewable energies. But then at the same time, as Rob pointed out, there are some economic feasibility issues and scale issues, and even there is fundamentally some supply and demand needs in certain areas called Northeast or in the Permian. They're flaring because of pipeline takeaway capacity issues. So how do you guys think about those investments?
Thank you so much.
So offshore wind and rooftop solar. I'm a believer in rooftop solar. I have 8.5 kilowatts of solar on the roof of my house in Austin, Texas. Why did I put them on? I got 3 different subsidies. I got a $7,700 write-off, or rather a tax credit, a reduction of $7,700 on my federal tax paid in 2017. So I want to thank all of you. You're the wind beneath my solar panels. Austin Energy paid $6,500 of the installation cost, and for the first couple of years I had it, I was being paid by Austin Energy $125 a megawatt hour at a time when the wholesale price of electricity in Texas was about $25. So I was getting 3 different subsidies. Now, is rooftop solar coming to parity? And you look at big companies, Walmart, other ones that are putting rooftop solar, and I think this is a great development. I see a much brighter future for solar than I do for wind based on just simple power density. You've got 10 times the power density in solar as you do in wind. So I'm very bullish on solar. As I said before, I saw it in Lebanon, saw it myself. And solar and storage, for a lot of people in rural areas, this is a game changer, a life changer. Offshore wind, again, call me a skeptic. Yes, there's tremendous offshore potential, but when you put anything in salt water, the costs triple, roughly. And you're also planning on putting, New York alone, 9,000 megawatts offshore. Well, so let's say, call them even 10 megawatt towers, then that's 900 offshore platforms. And you're going to put them in some of the most heavily fished and navigated waters on the eastern seaboard. What is that going to do for radar shadows? What does it do to the fisheries? The fishermen in Montauk are dead set against this. So it's complicated. There's no free lunch. And so this is, there's no such thing as a free lunch. Offshore, onshore, rooftop, you name it.
We are heading into lunch in just very quick few minutes,
well,
so I will turn to Dan.
Lunch reference is appropriate then.
So just on the discussion just now, knowing that Robert would be here, I pulled out, there's a great study from NREL that we can share. U.S., because he brought up the space issue, U.S.-based gigawatt capacity, 1,100 gigawatts, urban solar, conservative, 1,200, rural, 153,000, offshore wind, 4,200, onshore, 11,000, geothermal, 4,000. So I don't think we have a space issue. We have a political problem. In terms of the gentleman's question, I guess I would say that going forward, I think where we need to go ultimately is, I think the deal is there, a big slug of investment, and we can arm wrestle about the right mix in terms of CCS, solar, geothermal breakthroughs, more efficiency, better messaging, bringing people along to get there, but ultimately we need to go to a subsidy-free environment. That's where we need to go, where everyone gets an initial slug and they get up the outcomes curve and they hockey stick and the market recognizes them or not. Certainly oil and gas and nuclear seem to have had decades to have their chance and should be ready to go. Solar and wind, maybe less so, others are there. But I think the subsidy-free world, I saw a head nod, is good. And then in terms of how do we get there, I don't know what the next investment looks like. I do think the Green New Deal debate and the conversation that you guys are having here today is fantastic. When we rolled out the Apollo Alliance in 2003, we called for $300 billion and people thought we were crazy. 3 trillion proposals are out there, 30 trillion proposals are out there, some slug of investment to try to go up the mountain, mindful and having great skeptics like Robert making sure that we're not full of ourselves, I think would be a good way to go. So.
Thank you so much, Dan. Jonathan?
I'll just address the last question about oil and gas investing. So, look, the plain fact is that today we need oil and gas. We rely upon it for chiefly mobility, but also a lot for power generation. There's going to be a lot of continuing demand for oil and gas out into the future. There are things that we ought to be doing here to change that in our own, in this country, because frankly we have the ability to do so. But some of that story around the different needs where, energy for development in a lot of emerging economies, that's a critically important question. Second thought, the anxiety of the investor community cannot be denied. These are, hard-nosed business people who are saying, I'm not sure that's where I want to put my capital. As a result, you see some responses. For example, a recent rate filing that was done by Duke Energy that used a 15-year lifetime on a particular piece of infrastructure. This is the thing, the mark of things to come, that Duke is saying we're not sure we're going to want to be operating this asset more than 15 years into the future. Last thought, we are facing what is a process. We need to be serious about addressing climate progressively more and more from one year to the next. We need to do so in a way that is commensurate to the problem, and that means that we're going to have to be changing our energy economy. That's going to be a bumpy ride in some regards. We're not going to be doing everything the way that we used to. We can't afford to.
Thank you so much. Ladies and gentlemen, will you join me in thanking our distinguished panel?